I guess I'll start by saying hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on the HighByte Intelligence Hub. My name is Tony Paine. I'm the CEO of HighByte. With me is my fellow co-panelist, John Harrington. He is HighByte's Chief Business Officer. And it's an interesting time right now. So though I would normally close with this, I think it seems appropriate to thank everyone for joining us today. I know the world crisis surrounding COVID-19 has been a challenging time for all of us on both a personal and professional level. We at HighByte, we all hope that you, your families, your colleagues, partners, and customers are being able to stay safe. We recognize that you probably have many things on your mind and very appreciate you taking the time today to learn a little bit more about HighByte and HighByte Intelligence Hub. I will point out that this is our actual first Zoom-based webinar, so hopefully we can run through this without any technology bumps. If we do run into any, I appreciate your patience. With that, I'm going to shut off my video so it doesn't interfere with the slides and the demo. Thank you.
Are you good?
I'm just waiting for the bar to come up.
Tony, I'm going to jump on mute, and just to say to everyone, if there are any questions that come up that are specific that I can answer in the question and answer, I'll be available during the presentation. We'll also save most questions that would be appropriate for everyone to hear for the end, and we'll have plenty of time to go through a question and answer session at the end. But again, similar to Tony, welcome everyone to the presentation, and we look forward to I'm excited that everyone's here. I've talked with many of you over the last 6 to 9 months, and we look forward to leading you through the HighByte Intelligence Hub. Go ahead, Tony.
Great. Well, before we jump in and just demo the product, I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about HighByte, who we are as a company, and why we exist. Our goal is to have you leave this webinar with an understanding of HighByte and how the Intelligence Hub can actually accelerate the integration of Industry 4.0 applications. The Intelligence Hub does this seamlessly by connecting to existing operational infrastructures that leverage OPC UA. It allows you to create standardized data models that represent assets, systems, processes, roles, pretty much anything that can be populated with a combination of real-time data, computed data, or even metadata. And ultimately have that information be published to Industry 4.0 applications that leverage MQTT or even OPC UA. So while the product's going to continue to evolve, and I'll talk about that as we actually demonstrate the product, OPC UA and MQTT are the first 2 APIs that we added support for in this codeless environment. Finally, and to reiterate John's point, your participation is very important. If you have questions, please submit them at any time, and we'll answer as many questions during the presentation or at the end as we can. And if we can't, we'll follow up with you, after the fact. I also hope that many of you will engage with us after this demo. We're looking for partners, customers to help us drive the direction of the company, our products, as well as trial the initial version of Intelligence Hub, which we released about 5 weeks ago. So to start off, I'd like to talk a little bit about the HighByte leadership team. The leadership team is made up of Tori Penrod-Cambra, John Harrington, and myself. The 3 of us previously worked together at Kepler Technologies, a company that's now formerly part of PTC. In fact, as I look at some of the participants, many of you on the webinar have actually worked with us in the past. And I can just say that we are actually looking forward to continuing to work with you as members of HighByte. We founded HighByte in August of 2018 and quickly went to work to identify what I would say is a new set of market problems where we could leverage our experience to develop a team and solution around. And that first solution that we just brought to market is the HighByte Intelligence Hub. So I guess to start is, what are these market problems that we went after? And so as manufacturers embark on their digital transformation journey and try to reinvent themselves around Industry 4.0 strategies, the technology stack continues to get very complex. There are many more types of applications, as you can see here. Enterprise applications, role-based applications, service-based applications installed by vendors, these all need to work in concert with the classical operational applications that we're familiar with from our past. They need to work in concert so that they need to because they actually need to access some of the same operational data in order to provide value to their users. Unfortunately, each one of those applications requires its own unique data pipe that obtains access to the actual data and transforms it into usable information on a case-by-case basis. And what we're finding out and what we're hearing in the market is this simply isn't scaling well. And worse yet, many of those integration pipes between the various applications require some level of custom development. And the problem is many of those folks who actually understand operational data don't actually know how to code. They don't know how to secure data sent to the cloud, or they don't have time to solve the same type of problem over and over again based on an individual application's capabilities. That right there is why we created the HighByte Intelligence Hub. And so the HighByte Intelligence Hub, without writing a line of code or doing any scripting, users can make secure connections to OPC UA and MQTT applications. They can use models, develop models that actually standardize how information should be presented to applications. They can pull real-time data into these models. They can calculate new data sets. They can add metadata, or which we as industry call context. And then they can make this information available via data flows that can be universally understood by any application within the enterprise. Now, I could go on and talk about HighByte and the Intelligence Hub, but I think the real reason for today's webinar is to kind of just show you some of the basic functionality of the product. So I'd like to just jump in and allow you to see the HighByte Intelligence Hub in action. So to start, I'd kind of like to lay the groundwork here of sort of what we're actually going to demo today. If you remember at the beginning of the presentation, or just a few minutes ago, I mentioned that HighByte Intelligence Hub can seamlessly integrate with existing infrastructure. And a lot of infrastructure today, on the operations side, relies on OPC UA as sort of its data interoperability technology. And so we basically are going to demonstrate connecting to an OPC UA server and actually extending that capability for Industry 4.0. So what I started with is I grabbed an OPC UA server that I'm somewhat familiar with. And I basically modeled a couple things. There's a wide variety of people on this call with different backgrounds. So I tried to pick an example that hopefully everybody can relate to, something as simple as a thermostat. And I basically said, we'd actually have, a temperature or a thermostat in a room control that we actually want to monitor in a couple of our headquarters, one in Munich and one in Portland, Maine. Now, in the real world, this would probably be multiple UA servers, one installed in Germany and one installed here in the state of Maine. But for simplicity, I've kind of combined them in, and I've added them to this server. And I wanted to kind of point out a couple of things. As you can see, the system integrator or the end user who actually developed this might have picked one naming convention for how they wanted to represent temperatures and set points and limits. Another user may have done something totally different here in the state of Maine. And so we already see that sort of the standardization of how things are represented are either different or in some cases don't even contain the same information. In the case of Portland, we don't have access to min and max information. And so when a client looks at this, this is the classic view that everybody's familiar with. It basically is a pure OPC UA controller type view where hopefully there's some context in the actual item ID, so you can point out that, okay, this belongs to some kind of a network room in Munich, and I've got some kind of temperature. And then you can start examining the data and say, well, it seems to change about the same time, but it looks like these values here in the US are a little higher. Maybe that's because they're in Fahrenheit and Celsius. How am I going to standardize this across all my applications, across my entire enterprise across the globe? And that's why we basically developed Intelligence Hub. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to actually start an MQTT broker, which has become, one de facto standard for being able to go and publish information that's going to securely find its way into the cloud. And I've also got a client application, an MQTT client application that I'll actually subscribe to some data feeds, information feeds that the HighByte Intelligence Hub is going to basically, publish on a set of your build. So I'm going to connect this, and I'm going to basically subscribe to sort of a wildcard here of any topics we might actually be able to post. So that's my third-party environment. The only other thing of interest here is if I'm going to connect to OPC UA, I need to know sort of the endpoint as well as its security requirements. And I also have to make sure that there's a trust relationship. So we're going to bring up the Intelligence Hub here. And we're going to actually go in and we're going to start looking at connections. And that's really the place that you actually want to start integrating with the outside world. You want to be able to make a connection to a source of data that you can pull in and enrich, or you want to connect to a destination for where you want to actually publish results. And so as you can imagine, we're going to make connections to both the OPC UA server and the MQTT broker. So I'm going to get started here, and I'm basically going to just call this kept server EX, the UA server that we're going to connect to. And I'm going to actually pick the protocol. And as you can see today, we support two APIs, OPC UA and MQTT. We see ourselves adding various other types of protocols, or I should say APIs. APIs like SQL, support, generic REST support, and then there are a few other larger vendors who have their own proprietary APIs that we'll look at adding in the future. I'm going to pick OPC TCP, and that UA server and broker was running in a virtualized environment. So it's not running on the same machine as Intelligence Hub here. It actually was running on a machine called Paine apps, and it was listening on 49.320. And it required me to actually use security if you were able to see that in the endpoint configuration. So I'm going to make this a secure connection, accept the defaults for timeouts, and I'm going to actually close this out. At this point, I've actually defined a path to an OPC UA server, which in many cases is probably familiar for a lot of you on the phone. Now what I want to do is I actually want to pull in some of that raw data that we saw, those temperatures and those set points and stuff. And so to do that, I'm going to actually add inputs to this connection. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to click add. And if we could, we would have established a connection to the OPC UA server and actually browse the namespace to be able to go and see the data available. That actually failed because this is the first time that we're connecting to that server and we haven't established a trust relationship. So I want to go back in here and basically bring up the UA server and say, okay, here's the HighByte Intelligence Hub that I want to trust to be able to connect and actually obtain data. So we're going to trust that and then basically go back to our Intelligence Hub. And at this point, we're pretty much done with the third-party environment. We can stay here in the Intelligence Hub and do the rest of the work. Now I'm going to go back in and I'm going to re-add those items that I want to be able to browse. And I'm going to go in and I'm going to select them. They happen to be under a buildings folder. And there was sort of Munich headquarters. Let's just pull in all of these. And there was a Portland headquarters, and I'm going to pull in all of these. And given that for this demo, I only care about data ingress from OPC UA, I only care about inputs. So now I want to basically configure the second side of the equation. How do we go and actually connect to the MQTT broker once we have something that we actually intend to publish? And again, that's another connection. And so I'm going to go in here, I'm going to create a Mosquito connection. It's an open source MQTT broker. It too happens to be installed on the same exact virtual machine. In the real world, it would probably be on an independent machine. And it happens to be living on port 1883. And I'm going to basically fill in some MQTT specific settings that need to be set. Connection timeouts, keep alive rates, and a client ID. And I'm going to commit this change. Now, in the terms of the MQTT broker, we're going to actually publish out information or modeled information. And so what I want to do is I want to basically create a topic that I can actually publish to. Those are known as outputs. And so I'm going to go in here and I'm basically going to call this a buildings thermostat feed. And I'm going to put that on a topic that basically is really well known within my enterprise of global buildings thermostats. And this can be anything. And at this point, I've actually identified a topic that I can actually go and publish to on this MQTT broker. Now we're really all done with the outside world. We know how to communicate to the UA server. We know how to communicate to the MQTT broker. How do we enrich this data? And that's really where modeling comes into play. And so I'm going to come in and I'm actually going to model something. And a model can be many things. It can represent, like I said earlier, an asset. It could represent a role. It could represent a system, a process, you name it. For this example, I'm going to model a simple thermostat. Again, something we can all relate to. And I'm going to call this model thermostat. And I'm going to add some attributes to it. And so this is how I want every thermostat control across my entire enterprise to look like. So I actually want to know the location of the thermostat, which city. I want to actually know which room in a particular building, let's say. Of course, I actually want to be able to go and look at the temperature associated with the actual thermostat and the set point. And then it would be helpful to know the min and the max. What is actually in range and what's out of range. I think I'll actually provide some units. And lastly, let's just create an asset ID so that I actually know that the asset ID for every thermostat that I actually publish up in an enterprise. Well, every one of these attributes that actually defines this model needs a primitive data type associated with it. And so for a location, that's going to be a string piece of data. Same thing with the room. The temperature is going to be a floating point value. And since the set point and the min and max are also temperatures, we'll use the same data type for that. We'll give it some units that are going to be of type string. And our asset ID will allow for anything, so we'll pick a string as well. At this point, I've defined and said, I'm going to have a model called thermostat, and it's going to be represented, regardless of the underlying source, like this. It's going to have these attributes, and it's going to expect this framework. I can add and close this at this point, and now we've added our first model. Now the fun comes into play where how do we actually go instantiate that model, tie the real world to it so that we can actually go and normalize and standardize the data coming off these different environments. So the first one I'm going to create is sort of a Portland. We'll call it the Portland thermostat. And I'm actually going to go and pick the one type that we've defined, thermostat here. You can see it's pre-populated. And you can see that we can add expressions, or we can actually put in default values. Default values basically can be static, meaning you can't go collect something from a real-time data source or compute it. Or it could be a default value that actually gets set and is overridden once we can talk to a real-world system and actually do a calculation and pull it in. For some of these, we're going to have a mix here. So for location, let's assume that doesn't exist in an existing system today. So I'm going to put that directly into the hub. Same thing with the room attribute. But the temperature, if you recall, we can actually pull in right from that OPC server. And so I'm actually going to go in here and I'm going to pull in that temperature. I'm going to pull in that set point that we saw earlier. And then if you remember correctly, in Portland, we didn't have a min and max. Well, fortunately, I've talked to a controls engineer and I know what the expectation is for that particular server room. And it's between a high limit, a low limit of 65 degrees and 72. And of course, given that this demo is happening here in the US, we have to choose Fahrenheit. And then I'm going to give it an asset ID. I'm going to call this the Portland tstat, and it happens to be asset number 90,001. And at this point, I've actually filled out and said, here's a model that represents this thermostat at this location in this room. I'm going to do this one more time, and I'm going to actually do this for the Munich one. So as we go through this demo, I'm also going to point out some future things that we plan on adding in the very near future to our version 1.0 product, is the ability to create templates and pre-populate those. What I mean by that is I'm going to add another instance here from Munich. And it would be nice to be able to import all the work that I really just did in the Portland instance and be able to modify that. That doesn't exist today, but it's coming soon. So I apologize that I'm going to actually go ahead here and duplicate a little bit of effort. And I'm going to give it basically some units. We're going to basically make the German office conform to Fahrenheit as well. And we're going to give it an asset ID. So at this point, if you remember correctly, we had real world data for temperature, set point, min, and max. Not sure if you realized it, but in Munich, they were actually in degrees Celsius. So we're going to do some conversions here. So we're going to pull in the temperature. And we're going to do our fancy math to convert it over for what the Americans seem to like and don't want to move away from. And we're going to do that for all these temperature values. So we've got our set point. We've got our min. And we've got our max. And at this point, I've defined our instance for the Munich office. So at the end of the day, the only thing left to do here is to actually publish this out via MQTT so that applications can tie into that data feed and get consistency across what's happening in Munich versus Portland. So I'm going to add and close this.
Hey, Tony, can I interrupt you for a second?
Yeah, absolutely.
Can you go back into the Portland thermostat?
Yeah.
Let's edit that. I noticed that you grabbed the wrong room temperature.
You're absolutely right.
Set point. So
you're absolutely right.
It may confuse us when we get and looking at the data.
I appreciate those extra eyes.
No problem.
There we go. So now we have our unique Portland and our Munich instance that are defined with a little bit of normalization so that we can have consistency on how we view temperatures across the globe. We're actually going to create the flow. And the flow really is just how do I go and wire up the ability to start collecting raw data, create a model, instantiate it, I should say, and then populate it with either the static text, the real-time data, or computed data. And I'm going to do that by creating a flow. I'm going to give it a really short name here, flow 1. And I'm going to go and pick that Portland instance. And then I'm going to go pick the building thermostat feed. And we're basically going to publish this at 2,500 millisecond intervals. And I'm going to enable this view. Now, what I want to make sure is when we were in this demo environment, if I actually went ahead and actually started the broker, and I did. So at this point, I can actually commit this. And I can go back here to our application. And we're going to subscribe to data here. And you can see that now we've basically are publishing at a 2.5 second interval the actual values associated with that thermostat, as well as the metadata and the context that someone can actually use to say, okay, I understand that not only is this a temperature, it has units, there's a range of data that I should expect my values to be in. And here's some, asset information that, identifies that particular thermostat within the enterprise. I'm going to go back and we're going to wire up the Munich one as well, which is actually pretty much following the same steps. One of the things we're going to be adding in the next version here in the near future is the ability to do multiplexing, where you can have multiple outputs per flow. You'll see why that's important, because at the end of the day, I'm actually going to create a second flow right now that basically looks a lot like the one we just created. I'm just going to pick the Munich thermostat. I'm going to pick the same data feed, and I'm even going to pick the same interval. And so rather than having you repeat that process, you'll be able to multiplex to multiple outputs, which could be going over various APIs. That's a near-term backlog item that we're going to get into the product. So again, I'm going to add and close this at this point. So now again, when I come back here to the third-party environment where I look at my MQTT broker, I can now see that I'm streaming things. Now, whereas in the old world, you were limited by what that OPC UA server exposed, or any customization you wanted to do in the actual applications themselves that were consuming the data, you can now pull that into one central location, a hub-like product-like intelligence hub. You can add that context, all that metadata, all that computation, and then you can basically emit that out so that every application gets the exact same type of information that it can use. And these are extensible. I could go in right now and I could add additional attributes, and all of a sudden they too would start streaming. So I want to basically pause there for a second and kind of just regroup on what we've covered today. The goal here is to say, how do we simply go ahead and add industry 4.0 requirements to an existing installation, where that installation is running OPC UA. There's real-time data that's available, and then there's some internal knowledge that's known, but not in the system. With the Intelligence Hub, we can actually make the connections to those sources. We can go and actually figure out how we want to standardize the look and feel of a particular piece of information, such that the naming convention is consistent across the board. We can then actually go ahead and pull in, that real-time data, in some cases manipulate it like we did here with a simple conversion from Celsius to Fahrenheit, nothing complex, as well as add that metadata that actually provides the additional context that an application would need. And then lastly, we created flows that actually really were nothing more than, at what interval do I want to go and basically create this instance, populate it, and then transmit it. Now, flows also have additional functionality on the backlog right now. We realize that not everything is cyclic in nature. So some of these flows will also be able to be driven by events, perhaps a data change event, or some kind of query from a SQL database, or a schedule, time of day, if you will. And these flows are going to become more rich here in the very near future. I really wanted to kind of at least present to you sort of the basics of the Intelligence Hub today, so that we could at least start a conversation with our partners and customers to see, does the problems that we show resonate with you? Does the solution show you a way where you can actually go and knock down some of those barriers without actually doing custom development, and help us drive where we're going to take this going forward? So at this point, what I would like to do is bring up the presentation again. And one of the most valuable things for us, John and myself, and hopefully you, are really sort of a dialogue with questions and answers. And so I'm going to bring this up here, and I'm hoping some questions have actually come across the wire while I was doing the demo and the presentation, and we can address those now.
Tony, a question came up. Can we share models with other systems?
Yeah, so a couple of things. The answer is you can today. It's a bit of a manual process in that we've actually, you know what I'm going to do here? I'm going to get out of the presentation mode, and I'm actually going to go right in on a case-by-case basis here and see if I can manipulate. We actually have all the model information in a very open format. It's a JSON format, so something that's not proprietary to us. The last thing we wanted to do with this solution, which is really critical to integration, is force you to have to use our tool and lock everything into us. So these models are simply represented in a JSON format that you could take. You could take this file and you could bring it over to a different instance and basically stand those up without having to redo the work. Again, one of the things we have on the backlog right now is two things that really apply to that question. One is the ability to have a centralized URL where I can configure all the instances that might be running in a particular environment. So right now I showed a configuration of 1-to-1, one configuration to one instance of the hub. Let's assume you had 10 of those. You don't want to have 10 different configuration endpoint URLs. You want a centralized one where you can go in and see all of those 10. And with that, you'll be able to go and drag and drop and share these models. We're also basically going to support the ability to actually import and export parts of the functionality so that you can take those pieces of configuration, bring them to another site if it's not co-located, and be able to go and import those easily without having to reduplicate the work.
I think another thing to note specific to that question is if you have a third-party application that houses your models, we support an API to connect that application to ours so that it could just push the model dynamically.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's a great point, John. And what I'd like to add to that is this first release that we shipped 5 weeks ago allows you to create your own models from scratch. We recognize, as John said, that there are models that may already exist in these different systems, and we are going to be able to, whether or not it have to be a manual operation because of the third-party application, we're going to allow you to take those models and seamlessly bring them into our product. So for instance, technologies like OPC UA, which have complex data models in a type system, we want to be able to pull that in without having you, forcing you to do any other work, and allow us to work with those models and then transform them into other things that actually don't natively speak OPC UA. So think of it as, a place where you can start from scratch with models or leverage the existing, or even, we see ourselves building models that will include out of the box based on other types of standards that are in the industry.
Great. Tony, there's another question about I guess I'll call it the architecture of where we see the Intelligence Hub running, where the configuration runs, and generally how we expect that to be laid out. Is it at the edge? Is it in the cloud? Is it in the fog, somewhere in between? Maybe you could talk to that.
Yeah, I definitely see it closer to the edge, at least in the conversations we're having with end users today, primarily because I wish I could say every OPC UA installation out there is secure by nature. Unfortunately, many companies run without security and may not be allowed to turn security on. It's a tough thing to even discuss in today's day and age, but that might be the case. So obviously, if you're going to use a very unsecure flavor of a technology like that or in that certain configuration, you're going to want to push us as close to it so that we can make sure that the information that leaves us is actually going out in a secure manner. But I see anywhere between the edge and the fog where there'd be some delineation between sort of the operations network and the outside world, so it's not connected directly. In the cloud, I'm sure there will be some customers that'll do that. In the event that you are using secure OPC UA and MQTT, you probably could get around with that. Obviously, there's going to be firewall issues, given that today the OPC UA implementation we have is client server. We will eventually add what is known as OPC UA pub sub to make that firewall friendliness even better for the client server relationship.
Another thing to add to that, in some of my discussions with people that have come up, is that in many companies, the data science team is heavily involved, and the IT folks are heavily involved in working with the cloud-based technologies. And they're very familiar with Azure and AWS and all of their technologies. But the domain experts, the process control or the controls engineers, are more familiar with more on-premises applications and technologies. And whereas this tool, certainly from the mapping it from the OPC tags into the data models, really sits in the hands of the process engineers or the controls engineers who really understand those data tags. And they look for a tool like this to just really optimize and streamline and simplify their ability to hand off data for all those requests for data to send it to this analytic system or this IoT system. So putting it on-prem also puts it kind of in the domain of those domain experts that would be the people using the solution. Let's see. Lots of questions here. I'm just kind of going through them. Well, there's a question about the licensing model. Do you want to talk to that briefly?
Yeah, so the licensing model is, we see this sort of a site type license where we basically say you can install as many instances as you want within a particular, location. And that's basically going to be, a fixed price point, subscription based, paid annually, includes product updates, support, and all that good stuff. Right now, we're testing a $20,000 price point for that. And again, that's sort of no limitations into the number of instances you can run. And when I say instances, I mean of the hub, not the actual modeled instances. So you could run them across as many machines as you want, unlimited I/O. We also are going to have a single instance license where you basically can run one instance of the hub. Again, no limitations in terms of models and I/O for a $2,500 price point. Again, a subscription-based model where that includes access to support and upgrades throughout the year.
Tony, there's a question here about model hierarchy and multiple levels.
Yeah, that's a great question. So that too, and I I always hate to basically say the same thing that's going to be in the next release, but it is. It's actually on the backlog right now where we can actually add models to models. And so you can imagine that you might start off with modeling a thermostat. You might start off by, modeling a light system, an HVAC system, and a building. And then those richer models are just basically comprised of the smaller building blocks. And so we are going to support in the next one of the next future updates the ability to create and attach models to existing models and populate them. So it's on the roadmap. We see the importance. In fact, we were talking to a company yesterday that had a great use case, and I'll try to tie that in with some other functionality that we're working on. Is we see a very important pipe into this product being SQL, where you will be able to monitor real-time data, and then based on that real-time data, use that knowledge to make specific queries into MES systems or any other type of SQL data source, pull out configuration, or telemetry type data, parametric type data, bill of materials that will want to actually be able to go in and basically inject into these models and then publish them out. So it's the nesting of models as well as the variableness, I guess you could say, of a particular set of models in the data set.
Great. So there's a question about, are there any limits to the number of tags and the rates at which we're publishing data? I suppose it would be tags or even models.
Yeah, I mean, we've done some load testing on the product. One environment that I strive to hit early on was people want to be able to go and, at least some of the folks that we're talking to want to be able to install this on something as lightweight as a Raspberry Pi. Many companies are trying to harden those in sort of an industrial form factor, keeping them reasonably priced. So they want to be able to stand those up on the edge without standing up a computer. And so right now we have this hub basically pulling in 10,000 inputs, running through the transformation of a model, and then outputting 10,000 models in less than a second, working with very little CPU time, very little memory consumption. So the product itself is very platform independent and lightweight and easily embeddable. So we need to go and eventually keep taking that up and saying, okay, well, what is the limit where you need to start basically using multiple hubs? We've kind of, maxed out at sort of a 10,000 in sort of our initial demos as we kind of brought this to market. But as we continue to basically do internal testing and add more functionality, we're obviously going to continue to grow our test projects and enhance them to higher limits. There is no built-in limitation that we put into the product other than resource constraints.
Great. There's a couple of questions here pertaining to outputs, and specifically, could we output to SQL, and a little about the selection of MQTT. Maybe we can talk to why we chose MQTT and what whether we envision ever outputting to SQL.
Yeah, we do. I think one of the things that we see, if we want to be a codeless environment, we have to understand all the different ways of getting the data or the information into the various types of Industry 4.0 applications. And it's those APIs that we need to be able to implement and put in this technology stack so that people can just wire them up without even thinking about doing scripting or custom development. The reason why we chose OPC UA and MQTT was that OPC UA obviously is very well known on the operations side. There's a lot of connectivity out there, including the latest and greatest controllers where OPC UA is built right into them. On the actual outbound side, we see a lot of sort of cloud or Industry 4.0 applications that are at least MQTT compatible. They can actually subscribe to a broker and get the data. So our goal with this initial release was to say, what can we put in the product that, for lack of a better term, gives us, the biggest bang for the buck? How can we go in with, a small feature set for Rev 1 to prove this product out and get people using it and telling us what they need next, but at the same time, making sure that, we can be put into a lot of installations. We recognize that SQL is another one that is on the roadmap. We're looking at both inputs and outputs. I kind of alluded to the input one a little bit earlier in that We want to be able to drive queries to SQL data sources based on real-time data collection. We think that that's a very interesting differentiator for this product. But we also see the value in streaming it out. We are talking to a lot of customers and partners, and we'd love to add you to that list to see, what you see as more important, the ability to go and sort of do that rich ingress, or have, sort of another data logger type solution. And again, we're not going to stop there. We'll continue to look at other APIs and go where the market drives us. We'll be looking at some of the larger vendors that might have their own toolkits, as well as, when possible, prefer open standards.
Tony, there's a question about what amount of calculations we can do in the expressions in a model. So is it just simple mathematical expressions, or are there other things that we can do there?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And so, let me pull this up here, because I think this is what's being referenced here. I talk about this as a codeless environment because we want you to be able to wire stuff up that comes in and out without doing any coding. But we actually allow you to do some flexibility of scripting here. In fact, the expression is basically JavaScript. So, if you really wanted to get clever, you could actually write some pretty rich JavaScript to get the job done. Take some data that comes in, manipulate many things, enumerate it, and then actually ship those out. What our goal is to do is not take away that capability from a power user who knows JavaScript, but we envision that we'll put sort of an expression builder into the product where a user that isn't comfortable coding can actually push a few buttons and we'll actually build up that JavaScript for them. And so that's the capability to write native JavaScript is there in the product today. It's not our own home-baked scripting language.
And when I often talk to people, I say, we can perform your typical math functions. We can also perform some logic-based functions through that JavaScript capability. And we can also manipulate strings or convert values into other values. So for instance, if coming off a PLC, a data tag has a numeric value like 1, but that 1 is actually telling you that the machine is running, 0 means that it's in error, and 4 through 8 means that it's different phases of the process. You could encode that, or you could type that into this expression builder so that it's a more natural human readable value coming out of being put into the data object that comes out of the Intelligence Hub. So it's got that logic, it's got the ability to interpret data, and then the ability to run the math. Let's see. Many more questions. I'd like to see a demo version. Would we be putting it in GitHub?
Oh, interesting. So, right now today, we're basically walking people through a demo like this, and then we're providing them download access through our website to be able to go and get the bits and stand it up and actually execute it itself. We can look at GitHub if that makes sense for a lot of people in terms of a repository for which that could be acquired. It just isn't available today. It's through our website. We provide access to it based on sort of granting on a case-by-case basis.
Right. So go to our website and sign up, and we'd be happy to hook you up with the software to install yourself. Do you foresee the ability to generate events like a webhook output from models and inputs? I guess that's an event as a flow. I think you had talked about that earlier.
Yeah, so, if I understand that correctly, right today, if we look at our flows that basically start some sort of logic, it's really sort of the collection of inputs or a variable at some interval. This interval is sort of the event that drives that today. We're going to make that much more event-based. I mean, it's event-based today. It's based on a cyclic interval. We'll want that to be triggered from sort of some data change, quality change, time of day, and perhaps some result of a model. So that'll eventually find its way into sort of the flow capabilities of the product, if I understand the question correctly.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Maybe we can talk a little bit to who's our target customers and what use cases are they addressing. Didn't know if you want to talk to that or if you wanted me to talk to that, but.
No, go ahead, John. Since you've been talking to a lot of customers, I'll let you grab that one.
I'll give you a little rest. You can take a sip of water and kind of take a look at the questions, see if there's anything on there that you want to address. So we've been talking to a lot of different customers. We've been really going far and wide, trying to find the ones that this really hits with and really focuses in on. The primary areas that we've been focusing on is end users and in the discrete and batch manufacturing, because they tend to have a lot of disparate equipment, and they haven't been implementing a lot of historians and high-end data systems, and they're looking to get that data into IoT and start analyzing it. So that's one key area that we've been going after, though we've also had some conversations in the oil and gas side as well, specifically upstream. Most people are using us to, the first project or the pilot project is, let's just get the data up into Azure, AWS, so we can start looking at it in a much more understandable fashion. Some people are thinking about the use case of, I've got multiple sites. This kind of pertains to the oil and gas environment. I've got multiple fields, multiple locations. How do I aggregate that data back to corporate? We also have, the picture that Tony had showed early on, the PowerPoint, with lots of different client applications. So, the operations team just keeps getting asked by lots of different business professionals to get access to the data, the quality system, the ERP system, the this, the that. Kind of let me create a unified namespace that I can move the data through, and I can clean it up once and standardize it once, and that way when it goes to all these different systems, it's much easier. And that's where Tony had talked about being able to even model a system within the software. You may not be modeling an asset. It may be that you model a system, because that quality always has this data model that it wants to receive. So that's a key area. And finally, machine builders have been an interesting discussion that we've talked to some of them about, whereas they want an abstraction between their piece of machinery and the customer's data systems. They don't want to have to write unique data models into their machinery for every customer, because every customer wants access to data. They want an abstraction layer that they can take the customer's model, or the customer can even self-service. They provide them a list of tags, and the customer can manipulate them and modify them and map them into their own data models. So that's been an interesting opportunity for us. So I think those are our primary areas that we've been talking with people about in terms of use cases.
All right. Another question that came up, John, was, is it possible to communicate and take data from communication protocols over RS-485 and RS-232? And the answer to that is, yeah, today that would be via OPC UA. So we don't have native device protocol drivers that are part of the Intelligence Hub, who is really positioned to go in and sit on top of existing OPC UA data sources, for which underneath those are connections to those types of device protocols from various vendors. Will we look at industrial communication protocols as sort of native input connections in the future? We may, based on need, but right now we would really recommend that people use OPC UA for that, and find hopefully an already installed product that they can tap into and get access to that raw data, rather than put additional demand on the actual device network.
Exactly. There's also a number of open source, depending on how much data you're looking to flow and how sophisticated you need to get with it. There's some open source areas there that could help them out.
The other question was from Mohammed. I'm sorry. Is HighByte available in India? We're actually working to set up a channel partnership network right now. We actually will be releasing, we haven't already, we'll be releasing soon some communications on 2 partners that we've signed up and are happy to join us in our HighByte journey. And we're currently working with another one to represent HighByte in India. I actually have a call with that team next week to talk about how they could actually market, sell, and support the product in that region.
Great. There's also a question about it would be cool to add some contextual information and specifically data coming off the internet. So I think what the idea is with a thermostat, you may want to know the temperatures within the room and what's going on within the room. You may also want to add an ambient temperature. So that would be pulling like a REST service for a local weather service.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I know I probably, above and beyond OPC UA and MQTT, talked a lot about SQL today, but we see the ability to go and just make web service-based calls also be a very important connection component to the hub, where we could go and query that, temperature, weather information, and other things that are available through some, web tracker, let's say. So definitely a great idea, and definitely something that we want to be able to do in the product moving forward.
Great. Now this is an interesting one. It's a question about timestamp. Where does that come from? What's the source?
Yeah, so we're going to add some flexibility there over time. But what we've decided today, at least in the first release, was that given that our goal is to go and collect a bunch of inputs successfully, and it's funny, these instances that we put together, all the data came from a single OPC UA server. In the real world, we're probably going and pulling data from various UA servers, eventually a REST-based API, eventually SQL and whatnot. And so we need to be able to go and collect all that data, transform it into the actual model as you define here, and then basically once that's fully constructed, publish it to something like MQTT. When it's actually fully ready and constructed, so it's ready to be published, that's the timestamp that we actually are associating with the actual data feed. So if you looked here in this demo, you can see a timestamp that's part of this actual, let me take auto scroll off here and just go look at one of these. You can see a timestamp that basically, is a well-known timestamp format in the industrial space that basically, is the time that we actually were able to go and pull and fully construct this object. Optionally, we will at some point allow for us to basically, as the user, to extend these and say, well, in addition to the actual value, I want to have sort of the timestamp and perhaps other metadata associated with the actual individual attributes. And so we'll add that flexibility to be able to go and inject more stuff into this payload to meet your requirements. On the initial step, we decided to keep it very simple until we got feedback to see exactly what we needed to add and what was desired.
Great. It's a question about store and forward within MQTT, specifically a published client. I think, the short answer to store and forward, you can add to this if you want, Tony, but with MQTT, a lot of the broker is generally defined to be the ability to store the values and make it available to clients. So we haven't implemented store and forward as yet in the client.
Not yet, but it's definitely something that is probably going to be on the backlog in a future release.
I'll give you a last one. It looks like Apache Kafka. You have any thoughts on Apache Kafka?
Yeah, really haven't looked at it as sort of a messaging technology. You know, it has come up in a couple conversations, and you know, if it makes sense to be able to look at that as sort of you know, a plumbing or an infrastructure that we can actually, you know, publish to and allow sort of that messaging piece of technology to be able to go and communicate with other applications, you know, we'll look at it. You know, again, you know, our goal is to basically, at some point in time, allow you to be able to connect to almost any type of API that you would find in an industrial environment. You know, Kafka comes up and probably be something we look at in the future. We just got to figure out how to prioritize and get these kind of rolled out on a case-by-case basis. Definitely interested in following up with you offline, the person who posted that question, just so I can understand the use case and the opportunity and see what the requirements might be to do that. So at the end of this presentation, we're actually going to put our email addresses up on the slide and would welcome some additional conversation.
Tony, why don't you do that right now? We're actually, we've got 1 minute left. So maybe if we just skip to the last slide so that people can get our contact information, and I guess we just finish off the webinar.
Perfect. You know, yeah, to be respectful of your time, we are on the hour. Really would love to engage with all of you. Help us drive sort of where the company goes and where the product goes. At the end of the day, many of you on the phone know what customers are seeing on a day-to-day basis, either firsthand or through your relationships. We want to be there and help support you and solve those problems seamlessly. And we encourage you to reach out to us and start a conversation, as well as get access to the product and play with it and give us your feedback. We're going to leave our email addresses up here. If you don't get a chance to write them down, we will be releasing this webinar as a recording probably within the next day or two after it gets converted and you know, approved by marketing.
Great. Well, thank you very much, everyone. We appreciate it. Great talking with you. Great questions. Thanks for joining.
And if there were any other questions that got asked that didn't get answered, we'll capture those and we'll reach out to you offline. Thank you very much.